Margaret Whitmore had only meant to grab a quick latte and get on with her day in downtown Chicago. Yet, within minutes, her life would unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Driven by prejudice, she dialed 911 on a complete stranger, Danielle Carter, whose only crime was standing in the same coffee shop line. What Margaret never expected was that Danielle was no ordinary citizen. She was a CIA agent on a covert mission. The aftermath of Margaret's hasty call would spark a roller coaster of shocking revelations, legal showdowns, and one of the most dramatic, "you'll regret this," moments the city had ever seen. Margaret Whitmore was a 50-year-old woman who often found comfort in routines and familiarity. She lived in a tidy brownstone in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's more affluent neighborhoods. Each morning, she rose at precisely 6:15 a.m., let her golden retriever, Bailey, out for a short walk, then had exactly one slice of toast with a generous dollop of raspberry jam. She had done so for years, seldom questioning the monotony she seemed to relish. Margaret believed strongly in rules, order, and decorum. She also believed that people who didn't belong had to be kept in check. This mindset had festered in her over the years, turning into something far uglier than simple caution: veiled racism. Despite living in one of the most diverse cities in America, Margaret had managed to surround herself with people who thought like she did. Her circle of friends wasn't large, but it was tight-knit. Ladies from the local country club who often met for weekend brunches, sipping mimosas and exchanging quick quips about whoever wasn't present to defend themselves. Their idea of a crisis was the club running out of Chardonnay or a new neighbor letting their hedges grow too tall. But beneath her rigid manners, Margaret held silent resentments. She remembered her father, a retired police officer, telling her in her teenage years, "You've got to stay vigilant, Margaret. Some people just aren't like us." She had taken those words to heart, applying them with a brush broad enough to justify suspicion of anyone who looked, spoke, or acted differently from her. When Margaret ventured outside her usual confines, her anxiety spiked. City life in downtown Chicago teemed with faces from every background. Though she never said it out loud, part of her always felt threatened when she stepped outside Lincoln Park's tidy boundaries. She told herself it was a prudent fear, a self-defense mechanism in a world growing more chaotic. She didn't see it for what it really was: prejudice so deep that she could hardly function without leaning on it. On the fateful morning that set everything in motion, Margaret decided to leave Lincoln Park to visit a brand new Starbucks on Michigan Avenue, an anomaly in her routine. Normally, she would have stuck to her local cafe, but her nephew had recommended the new Starbucks for its special seasonal beverage she just had to try. Curiosity piqued, Margaret maneuvered her pearl-white BMW through traffic, mentally congratulating herself on her willingness to be adventurous for a change. As she found parking in a busy downtown lot, her comfort bubble began to shrink. People passed by in a hurried blur, some in business suits, others in casual attire. The sidewalks bustled with tourists snapping photos of the city's skyscrapers, students from the University of Chicago weaving in and out of shops, chattering with excitement as they rushed to morning lectures. The swirl of activity was overwhelming. Margaret kept her sunglasses on as she walked, clutching her handbag a little tighter whenever someone passed too close. She felt relieved when she finally saw the familiar green Starbucks logo. This was territory she understood: lines, a menu, and polite baristas. She only had to get her coffee, maybe find a small table by the window, and wait for her nephew to join her. Inside, Margaret exhaled a breath she had been holding. Sure, it was crowded, but the hum of the espresso machines and the aroma of roasted beans were comforting. She stepped into the queue, eyeing the chalkboard menu. Her nephew had suggested a salted caramel mocha, something Margaret wasn't used to, but she felt an urge to try. Then she noticed the woman standing in line just ahead of her. A tall, poised black woman wearing an immaculate navy blue blazer, black slacks, and sleek low heels. Her hair was styled in a neat twist, and she balanced her phone in one hand while checking something on a notepad in the other. Margaret observed how calmly she stood, how confident she appeared. Something about that woman's composure made Margaret uneasy. She instinctively shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Just as Margaret's mind began to wander, wondering why the woman was so intensely focused on her phone, a gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me, the woman said, stepping aside so Margaret could edge past if she needed more space. Margaret blinked, muttered a quick, "Sorry," and resumed her position, but she was on high alert, an anxious distrust thrumming in her chest. She was a high-level CIA operative stationed at the agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia. But on this particular mission, she found herself in Chicago. The assignment was covert, of course. Most of her colleagues weren't even aware of its specifics. It involved an international narcotics syndicate believed to be funneling illegal profits through local businesses. Danielle's expertise in financial tracking made her the perfect agent for the job. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Philadelphia, Danielle had learned early on how to adapt and thrive. Her parents, both educators, instilled in her a strong sense of justice and the importance of humility. She excelled in school, and after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania with honors in political science, she had her pick of law schools. But Danielle chose a different path, one that aligned with her desire to serve her country and combat bigger threats to society. She joined the CIA. Over the years, Danielle rose rapidly through the ranks, landing critical missions. Her current operation in Chicago required her to blend in as a financial consultant. On that Friday morning, she had a meeting set at the Starbucks on Michigan Avenue, where she would finalize details about which local businesses the cartel might be using for money laundering. As she waited for her coffee, Danielle noticed the middle-aged white woman behind her. Margaret seemed tense, her posture stiff, her eyes darting suspiciously. Danielle mentally cataloged the details: the structured bob haircut, the crisp pastel blouse, the barely contained anxiety. Danielle had seen this look before. Margaret didn't know it, but her paranoia was about to backfire spectacularly. Because when the police arrived, sirens blaring, they weren't just responding to a baseless 911 call. They were about to detain an undercover CIA agent in the middle of an active operation. And by the time the truth was revealed, Margaret would regret the call more than she ever could have imagined. As she placed the 911 call, her pulse pounded with self-righteous certainty. She had convinced herself she was preventing a crime, doing her civic duty. "Better safe than sorry," she whispered under her breath as she discreetly watched Danielle Carter from her seat near the window. Meanwhile, Danielle had no idea she was being watched. She had just received confirmation that her informant would meet her in 30 minutes. She sipped her black coffee, mentally running through the key points of her upcoming conversation. Then came the sirens. Danielle's years of training made her hyper-aware of sudden disruptions. Her instincts kicked in when she heard the approaching police vehicles, but she remained composed, only turning slightly to assess the situation. Then she saw them. 2 Chicago police cars screeched to a stop outside the Starbucks. Officers emerged quickly, their hands near their holsters, scanning the crowd. From her vantage point, Margaret leapt to her feet, nearly knocking over her drink. Waving frantically, she pointed directly at Danielle. "That's her. That's the woman I called about," Margaret shouted, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Danielle frowned, her body stiffening as 2 officers approached her with unmistakable caution. "Ma'am, step aside and show us your hands," one officer ordered, his tone firm. Danielle instinctively complied, raising her hands, her coffee cup still in one. Her heart hammered, not out of fear for herself, but for how quickly situations like these could spiral out of control. "Officers, what's going on?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the indignation bubbling inside her. The officers exchanged a glance, still assessing the potential threat. They had no choice but to treat the call as serious until they had more information. Meanwhile, Margaret stood nearby, her expression a mix of triumph and unease. She was acting suspicious, whispering on her phone, looking around like she was planning something, Margaret insisted. Danielle exhaled slowly, realization dawning. This woman called the cops on me? Her fingers twitched with frustration, but she stayed calm. She had handled cartel members, corrupt officials, and foreign spies. She could handle this. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back," the second officer instructed. Danielle's lips parted in disbelief. "You're detaining me?" she asked, her voice measured but incredulous. The officers stepped closer. One reached for her waist, where he immediately felt the concealed firearm. She's armed, the officer shouted. Danielle barely had time to react before she was forcibly turned. Her arms wrenched behind her back as cold metal handcuffs locked around her wrists. Gasps rippled through the Starbucks. Several customers pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Danielle gritted her teeth, knowing she had to de-escalate. "I am a federal agent," she said firmly. "CIA. My credentials are in my blazer pocket. You need to verify my identity right now." But adrenaline had already taken hold. The officers, focused on the weapon, were treating her as a threat first and a possible federal agent second. Margaret, watching it all unfold, felt an odd mix of emotions, relief that she had acted, but also a creeping, gnawing doubt. The lead officer pulled Danielle's wallet from her blazer and flipped it open. His eyes flicked over the official ID, his expression shifting from suspicion to shock. A heavy silence fell between them. "Wait, this says..." The officer's voice trailed off as he processed what he was looking at. His partner peered over his shoulder, his brows furrowing. Then they both looked up at Danielle, their hands suddenly uncertain as they realized they had just handcuffed a CIA operative. Danielle stared at them, unimpressed. "Now do you want to listen to me?" she said coolly. Margaret felt the floor beneath her tilt. "She's CIA?" she murmured. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The one holding her ID swallowed hard. Sergeant Boyd, we have a situation," the younger officer muttered. Sergeant Boyd, the older of the two, exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Ma'am," he addressed Danielle carefully, "we need to verify this with headquarters, but if this checks out, we're going to have to let you go." Danielle clenched her jaw but gave a curt nod. "Do what you have to do. But I expect an apology when you realize you just detained a federal agent for no reason." As one officer stepped away to radio in for verification, Margaret's stomach churned with growing dread. She had expected to be hailed as a responsible citizen, not to watch the officers stumble over themselves trying to undo what she had started. Margaret felt a cold sweat break out across her back. Oh no, what have I done? She watched in horror as the officers hesitated, realizing the gravity of their mistake. The Starbucks had gone completely silent except for the distant crackle of the police radio as one officer called in to confirm Danielle Carter's credentials. Danielle, still in cuffs, exhaled slowly, keeping her temper in check. She had been through worse situations in foreign operations, but this? Being detained by local law enforcement in the middle of an active mission because of a racist assumption? This was a new level of infuriating. She locked eyes with Margaret, who now looked as if she wanted to shrink into the floor. Danielle could see it. The dawning horror, the creeping realization that she had just made a terrible mistake. Margaret had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The officer who had taken Danielle's credentials finally received confirmation over the radio. "Dispatch, we have verified identity. Subject is confirmed as CIA. Repeat, confirmed federal agent." A stunned silence followed. Sergeant Boyd, now visibly paler, let out a slow breath. "Uncuff her. Now." The officer behind Danielle hesitated for just a moment before fumbling with the keys and unlocking the cuffs. As soon as they were off, Danielle flexed her wrists, the faint red marks on her skin a clear reminder of how quickly things had escalated. "Ma'am, we sincerely apologize," Sergeant Boyd said carefully. "We were acting on a report." Danielle turned to face him, her tone sharp. "A false report. A report based entirely on paranoia and racial bias. Do you even understand how dangerous this could have been? Do you know how many people like me, who don't have a CIA badge, have been hurt or killed because of reckless calls like this?" The younger officer looked down, clearly uncomfortable. The weight of the moment was sinking in. But Margaret? She was frozen, her mouth slightly open, her face ashen. "You," Danielle said, taking a slow step toward her. "You called the cops on me?" Margaret swallowed hard. I thought. You were acting strange, and with everything going on in the world, I just wanted to be careful." She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Danielle let out a humorless laugh. "Careful? You wanted to be careful?" She shook her head, exhaling sharply. "You mean you saw a black woman, dressed professionally, looking at her phone in a coffee shop, and decided I was a criminal? Margaret's lip quivered. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, Danielle interrupted, her voice cutting. You meant to call the cops. You meant to describe me as suspicious. You meant for them to come here, guns ready, because in your mind, I didn't belong. You didn't just ruin my morning. You could have ruined my life. Margaret's knees felt weak. The entire Starbucks was watching now, the weight of dozens of judgmental stares pressing down on her. Some people whispered. Others simply shook their heads. A few were still recording. Danielle turned back to the officers. I want the name of the person who made this report, she demanded. Sergeant Boyd hesitated but nodded. It's public record. He cleared his throat. Margaret Whitmore. Danielle's eyes flickered with recognition. She filed the name away in her mind, already considering her next steps. Miss Carter, Sergeant Boyd said carefully. Again, I sincerely apologize. We will include all of this in the report, and if you'd like to file a formal complaint. Oh, I will, Danielle assured him, her voice like steel. Margaret felt sick. The reality was crashing over her in waves. Her name in a police report, her actions exposed, and now, the terrifying possibility of legal consequences. Danielle gathered her composure, adjusting her blazer. Are we done here? Because I have a meeting to get to. An actual important one. Sergeant Boyd nodded. Yes, ma'am. You're free to go. Again, we're sorry. Danielle cast one final look at Margaret, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and strode out the door, leaving Margaret standing there, drowning in shame. Margaret didn't remember driving home. Her mind was spinning, replaying every moment. Danielle's furious gaze, the officer's embarrassment, the way the entire Starbucks had looked at her like she was that woman. She barely noticed Bailey barking as she walked into her Lincoln Park home, her hands shaking. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and called the only person she could think of. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Margaret? It's past 9. What's wrong? Margaret, I messed up, she blurted, her voice cracking. Her longtime friend Margaret Taylor, a retired paralegal, sighed. What did you do? Margaret Whitmore swallowed hard. I called the cops on a woman in a Starbucks, and she turned out to be, she was CIA. Silence. Then, oh my God, Margaret. Margaret recounted everything in a rush. The suspicions, the phone call, the way Danielle had stared at her after being uncuffed. When she finished, there was another long pause. This is serious, Margaret Taylor said carefully. You do realize she could sue you, right? Or worse, the city could charge you with filing a false police report. Margaret's breath caught. But I thought. You thought wrong, Margaret Taylor snapped. And now you might have to deal with the consequences. Margaret felt like she might vomit. What do I do? She whispered. Her friend hesitated before answering. You need to apologize. And you need a lawyer. Immediately. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling her world tilt. She had spent her life believing she was a good person, but in one morning, she had shattered that illusion, and she had no idea if she could ever fix it. Margaret Whitmore barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every humiliating detail. The sharp click of the handcuffs, the way the Starbucks patrons had stared, the fury in Danielle Carter's eyes. But what haunted her the most was the realization that she couldn't take it back. By morning, the news had already started to spread. Local headlines didn't name her outright, but the story was unmistakable. CIA agent wrongfully detained after 911 call based on suspicious behavior. Racial profiling incident in downtown Chicago sparks outrage. Anonymous caller's false report nearly disrupts federal investigation. Margaret didn't need them to print her name to know that everyone at her country club, in her social circles, and even in her neighborhood would connect the dots. And then came the knock on her door. Her stomach twisted as she opened it to find a uniformed officer standing on her front porch, holding an official-looking envelope. Mrs. Whitmore? Her mouth went dry. Why, yes. The officer handed her the envelope. You've been summoned for questioning by the district attorney's office regarding the 911 call you placed yesterday. You may want to consult an attorney. Margaret barely heard the rest. The blood drained from her face as she clutched the envelope, her hands trembling. This was real. This was really happening. The moment she left the Starbucks, she made 2 phone calls, one to her superior at the CIA, the other to her father. Daniel Carter had spent decades working in the Department of Justice, specializing in civil rights enforcement. He was retired now, but his connections ran deep. And when Danielle told him what had happened, his response was immediate. "This isn't just about you, Danielle," he said, his voice low with anger. "This is about setting a precedent. People like her need to understand that there are consequences." Danielle agreed. She had debated whether to press charges, whether it was worth it. But then she thought about all the times things like this had happened to people without her credentials, and she made her decision. By the end of the day, the district attorney's office had been looped in. There had been a rise in racial profiling cases across the country, and this one had the added weight of involving a federal agent. Danielle wasn't interested in revenge, but she was interested in accountability. So when the DA's office agreed to question Margaret Whitmore for filing a false police report, Danielle made it clear. "I will testify, and I won't let this slide." Margaret Whitmore arrived at the Cook County District Attorney's office 2 days later, her lawyer, Richard Hale, by her side. The DA's office had been direct. They were considering filing formal charges against her. If convicted, she could face a misdemeanor charge, a fine, probation, or even a civil lawsuit. Margaret sat stiffly in the cold, gray conference room, her fingers twisted together in her lap. When the assistant district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa Morales, sat across from her, Margaret could barely meet her gaze. "Mrs. Whitmore," ADA Morales began, "do you understand why you're here?" Margaret swallowed. I didn't mean for any harm to come to her. I truly thought I was doing the right thing." Morales folded her hands. "And yet, Mrs. Carter, a federal agent, was detained, publicly humiliated, and had her mission compromised because of your actions." Margaret's face burned. "The issue here," Morales continued, "isn't just that you called the police. It's why you called the police. You had no real evidence of criminal activity. You simply saw a black woman on her phone and assumed she was dangerous." Margaret's throat tightened. "This is not the first time you've done this, is it?" Morales added, sliding a document across the table. Margaret's eyes widened as she recognized the records, her past 911 calls. She had forgotten. 6 different calls over the last 5 years, all reporting black individuals in her neighborhood for things like standing near a bus stop or talking loudly on their phones. Her stomach twisted. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have 2 options," Morales said. "We can take this to trial, where you risk a formal charge of filing a false police report, a hefty fine, and potential probation. Or," she glanced at Margaret's lawyer, "you can agree to a plea deal." Margaret held her breath. "You will plead guilty, pay a fine, and enroll in a court-mandated racial bias training program." Margaret felt like she had been punched in the gut. Richard Hale leaned in. "We need to consider this carefully." "I'll do it," Margaret blurted, surprising even herself. Morales raised an eyebrow. "I'll take the deal," Margaret said, her voice shaking. I don't want to drag this out." Morales studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll move forward with the agreement." Margaret exhaled shakily. Her life as she knew it was over. The story didn't disappear. For weeks, local news outlets covered the incident. Margaret's name was never explicitly printed, but in social circles, everyone knew. Her country club membership was quietly suspended. Some of her friends stopped returning her calls. The whispers followed her everywhere. But worse than the social exile was the bias training. She had scoffed at it at first, but when she actually sat in those classes, listening to speakers talk about the real dangers of racial profiling, the lives lost, the harm caused, something inside her cracked. For the first time, she listened. She thought about her father's words growing up, about how easily she had assumed she was protecting her community when all she had done was harm people. She hated the way it made her feel, but she kept going. She read. She studied. She forced herself to confront what she had done, and it was painful. Her mission in Chicago was a success. The cartel operation was dismantled, arrests were made, and Danielle received commendations for her work. But the Starbucks incident remained in the back of her mind. 2 weeks later, just before flying back to Langley, she made one last stop. She stood outside Margaret's house, debating whether she should even be here. Then, taking a deep breath, she knocked. When Margaret opened the door, she looked stunned. "Miss Carter, I just came to see if you actually learned anything," Danielle said flatly. Margaret swallowed hard. I'm trying." Danielle studied her carefully. She could see the exhaustion in Margaret's face, the weight of everything she had been forced to confront. Finally, Danielle nodded. "Good." She turned to leave, pausing only to add, "But don't expect forgiveness. You have to earn that." Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes. As Danielle walked away, she knew one thing for certain. Margaret Whitmore's life would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real justice. For weeks after her guilty plea, Margaret Whitmore's life felt like a waking nightmare. The $5,000 fine had been painful, but the real punishment was the realization that she had become the woman people whispered about. The country club? She stopped going. The pitying glances were unbearable. Her old friends? Most had distanced themselves, not because they disagreed with what she had done, but because they didn't want to be associated with the fallout. But the hardest part was the racial bias training. It wasn't just lectures or worksheets. It was confrontation. She had to sit in a room, week after week, listening to people of color share their experiences of being profiled, harassed, and even assaulted because of assumptions made by people like her. At first, she had bristled, resisting every lesson. "I'm not a racist," she had argued, until one of the speakers, an older black woman, had asked her point blank, "Then why did you assume that woman in Starbucks was a criminal?" Margaret had no answer. That moment haunted her. The reality of what she had done, the harm she had nearly caused, settled into her bones like a sickness she couldn't shake. She had spent her life believing she was good, but now she had to face the truth. She had weaponized the police against an innocent woman, and worse, she might have done it again if she hadn't been caught. She had bigger things to deal with. Back in Langley, Danielle had been thrown into her next assignment, a high-priority case involving foreign cyber threats. There was no time to dwell on the past. But one evening, after a long day of briefings, she got a message from an unexpected source. Her father. "You might want to see this," he had texted, attaching a link. Danielle clicked it, her brow furrowing as an article popped up. "Woman who called 911 on CIA agent speaks out. I had to face the truth about myself." She scoffed. Great, she thought. Is this a redemption tour? But as she read, her expression slowly shifted. Margaret Whitmore, it seemed, had actually learned something. In the interview, she admitted, publicly, that she had been wrong, that her fear had been nothing more than prejudice disguised as concern, that the bias training had forced her to face things she never wanted to acknowledge. "I know I can't undo what I did," Margaret was quoted saying, "but I can choose to be different going forward. And that's what I intend to do." Danielle sat back, staring at the screen. She wasn't sure if she believed Margaret, but she knew one thing for sure. She had forced at least one person to confront their racism. And sometimes that was how change started. Danielle closed the article and exhaled slowly. Then she went back to work. Because there were bigger fights ahead, and she intended to win all of them.